morning and thank God it's Friday, and of course it's the last Friday of the month of August 2021. And on this note, I welcome you to today's daily newspaper front page stories for this morning. I have with me this morning the Punch newspaper, Daily Sun newspaper, the Nation newspaper, the Guardian newspaper, and lastly the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. Well, of course, like we do it, I start with the Punch newspaper this morning. On the front page story of the major stories on the front page story of the Punch newspaper this morning, on the news headline I have troubles ahead. Troubles ahead. Experts warns as debt servicing gobs 91% of revenue. Revenues records 1.07 trillion naira shortfall. Government can sustain rising debt, says economist. We are in serious trouble. Government will borrow more, says Utomi and others. And the stories can be found on page 10 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. Moving above the major news headline, says Nigeria records 5.1% GDP growth. Economists doubt figures. Nigeria records 5.1% GDP growth. Economists doubt figures. And this story can be found on page 20 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. Moving down below it is on the matter of insecurity in Nigeria. Sit up, Sultan, Autumn, others tell federal government bandits may take over villa government wants. You can turn into page 2 this morning of the Punch newspaper to read more on that story. And then moving below that on PDP crisis, and that's on Paralympics. I can't eat, says elated gold medalist Tijani. I can't eat, and that is coming from the elated gold medalist Tijani. You can turn into page 27 of the Punch newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving below the major headline is I lost my son, brother, house to Yewa attack, and that is coming from the Plateau youth leader. I lost my son, brother, house to Yewa attack. And you can turn it to page 7 this morning to read more on that story. And still on the front page stories of the Punch newspaper this morning, and that's on page 25. NNPC posts first profits in 44 years. Stakeholders applaud feat. NNPC posts first profits in 44 years. Stakeholders applaud feat, and that's NNPC posting their profits after 44 years. And next to read is on page 7. Bandits free Niger Islamic pupils, Zamfara Agric students. Bandits frees Niger Islamic pupils and Zamfara agriculture students. And that's on page 7. And then moving below that on page 2. Organizers suspend Saudi Arabia recruitment as DSS disperses doctors, arrest journalists. You can turn into the Punch newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving to page 4 and 5. Hoodlums adopt, kill Lagos guard over market tussle. You can get a copy of the Punch newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then lastly, on the front page story of the Punch newspaper this morning, and that's on Autumn's interview. Sans berates embassy for grilling Channel TV presenters. Sans berates embassy for grilling Channel TV presenter. And that's all on Punch newspaper this morning. And then moving ahead, it's on Daily Sun newspaper. The major news headline says Sultan rises the alarm over worsening insecurity. Says insists Nigeria must renegotiate its peace and unity. And President Buhari aware of security challenges concerned, says SGF. And then on Catholic, bishops call for end to violence, bloodletting. You can turn into page 7 this morning of the Daily Sun newspaper. And then moving above the major news headline, Outrage as embassy queries Channels TV for interviewing Governor Otom. Summons reporters crew to Abuja. You can get a copy of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving below the major news headline is no land for ranching in Ebonyi, Umahi, Oyanese youths insist. Governor debunks federal government's alleged 6 billion release. You can turn into page 8 this morning of the Daily Sun newspaper to read more on that story. And then moving ahead of it is on page 6. Court restores second dose after PDP NEC announced Akinwumi as AG's chairman as the assistant chairman. Court restores second dose after PDP SEC announced Akinwumi as the assistant chairman of the People's Democratic Party. You can turn into page 6 this morning to read more on that story. And then on page 5, that's on the issue of Hush Puppy. Committee submits reports on Abba Kyari to IGP. The committee has submitted their reports so far to the IGP on the case of Hush Puppy and Abba Kyari. You can turn into page 5 this morning to read more on that story. And then moving to page 8, it says NAD directs members to continue strike. Demands National Council on Health Intervention. And you can turn into page 8 this morning to read more on that story. And then moving ahead to page 3, says Abia at 30. Abia State at 30, Kalud advocates inclusive leadership. Government deserve all producing development commission. Government deserve oil producing development commission. You can turn into page 3 this morning of the Daily Sun newspaper to read more on that story. And still on the front page stories of the Nigerian Daily's newspaper, and that's on Daily Sun this morning. It says NNPC declares 287 billion naira profit after tax for 2020. NNPC declares 287 billion naira profit after tax for 2020. Losses reduced from 802 billion naira in 2018 to 1.7 trillion naira in 2019. You can turn into page 2 this morning of the Daily Sun newspaper to read more on that story. An tension in Abia community as family of 7 dies after eating suya. Tension in Abia community as family of 7 dies after eating suya, and that's on page 5 inside the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And then moving ahead, I have made the Nation newspaper. On the major news headline, it says how to end killings by Sultan Christian elders. How to end the killings in Nigeria, and that is coming from the Sultan and the Christian elders. It says Catholic bishop conversed new strategies. Catholic bishop have conversed on new strategy of the way to stop the killings in the north, especially in the northern parts of Nigeria and the southern parts of the country. Government working hard, says SGF. Governments are working hard towards ending the killings in the country, and that you can read on the front page of the Nation newspaper this morning. And then moving above the major news headline, it says government spends 2.02 trillion on debt servicing, says budget office. MBS economy grew by 5% in second quarter. You can read this story on the front page of the Nation newspaper, and also continue it inside the page 4 of the Nation newspaper this morning. Moving ahead on page 5, governors to work with silver panel on PRA's grey area. You can read this story on page 5. And the next read is on page 6. Why we are not suspended strike, says by doctor. Federal government insincere. And then moving next to read is on page 6. NNPC posts 287 billion naira profit after 44 years low. Tejina Islamia school pupils would gain freedom. You can read that story on page 3 this morning on the Nation newspaper. And then moving ahead, I move to the Guardian newspaper this morning. On the front page stories of the Guardian newspaper and on the major news headline, it says, surprise! Economy gains highest quarterly growth since 2015. Buhari lost GDP 5.0% growth in second quarter 2021. Economists means figures as reflection of last year's deep dive, and then growth needs to be sustained before 2023 elections slows economy down, says Riwan. In part, on citizens' welfare matters most, and that is coming from Yusuf. Transport growth is first sign of recovering economy. Expert says more potential in telecom calls for better policies. Ari replaces Kalu as the head of MBS statistician, and that is coming from the General. You can read the story on page inside the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then moving above the major news headline, it says Tajina Islamia pupils released 88 days after adoption. You can read more on that story inside the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then moving to page 3, be decisive with insecurity, Sultan Ayokunle advises President Muhammadu Buhari. And then on page 3, NNPC posts false profits of 287 billion naira after 44 years of existence. And then moving ahead, that's on page 4. Nigeria more divided today than it was 4 years ago, a high-paced survey reveals. You can find out more on that story this morning by getting a copy of the Guardian newspaper to read more on that story. And then moving below the major news headline, in a new twist, court restores Secondos as PDP chairman. In a new twist, court restores Secondos as PDP chairman and opposes Akinwumi. That's on the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then this called the 9 lobbying neck on eligible customer policy suspension. This called the 9 lobbying neck on eligible customer policy suspension. You can read the story on page 20 inside the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then going forward, and that's the last newspaper for today, and that's the Daily Independent newspaper. On the front page stories of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning, I have PDP leadership crisis. Secondos fights back. Court restores him as national chair. Atiku resurfaces in PDP 24 months after. Explains self. You can find the major story on this highlights on the Daily Independent newspaper front page. And then moving above the major news headline, Port Harcourt Airport not safe for flying, stakeholders warn. Port Harcourt Airport not safe for flying, stakeholders warn. You can read the story inside the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. And the next read is Buhari excited as Nigeria's economy grows 5.01% in second quarter 2021. Declares profits after tax of 287 billion naira for NNPC. You can get a copy of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving below the major news headline, resident doctors vow to continue strike despite court order. You can read that on the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. And then moving to page 4, Embassy threatens to sanction China's television over Otto's interview. Yakas urges NUJ and JE to speak out. You can read this story on page 4 inside the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. And then moving forward, that's to page 5, PDP to Buhari presidency. You, not Autumn, is spreading division and hate. You can read the story inside the Guardian newspaper this morning on page 5. Still on page 5, hoodlums attack policemen conveying murder suspect to Elisha prison. Kill one, others escape with bullet wounds. You can read more on that story by getting a copy of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving still on page 5, expect 3 days heavy rain in Kano, Kaduna, others, and MGT warns. Expect INET once. You can read that on page 5. And then lastly, on the case of Hush Puppy and Abba Kyari, IGP received panel reports on Abba Kyari. You can turn into page 5 this morning to read more on that story. And then on this note, we've come to the end of the Gallery TV newspaper review this morning. Don't forget to join us by 12 p.m. and of course 4 p.m. for yet another news update. I remain Titilayo Olamide. Thanks for watching and do have a lovely day.